Было бы интересно узнать,
It would be interesting to know whether Piltdown man was accustomed to think about anything beyond his immediate creature comforts. Whether, for instance, he felt any curiosity about the world and sky around him, or whether he had any idea of entering on another life after death.
после смерти.
This is what British paleontologist Sir Arthur Woodward wrote poetically about Eoanthropus, also known as the Piltdown man. Freaks of every kind will now be using this picture. Life after death was ensured for Eoanthropus dawsoni, a mix of human and red ape.
Чему нас учит история Piltdown?
What are the lessons learned from the Piltdown hoax? Just how harmful was it for science? And are there any myths associated with the Piltdown man? In 2014, a book I wrote on human evolution came out. A special chapter in it is dedicated to the Piltdown hoax. 7 years on, I have to admit I'd rewrite some of the facts in that chapter if I could. Or I rewrite the whole chapter indeed. This is how it all began. In 1908, amateur archaeologist Charles Dawson stumbled on a piece of an ancient skull near Piltdown, Sussex. According to paleontologist Sir Arthur Woodward's report, based on Dawson's own words, the latter told the workers who were digging gravel to report any unusual finds to him and promised to pay them handsomely. The workers found a skull, but they thought it was a coconut. A coconut in an English gravel pit, so trivial. The object seemed familiar to the workers, but since it was a little cumbersome to store, they allegedly broke it up with a shovel and threw all fragments away, but one, which they demonstrated to Mr. Dawson at the first opportunity. The workers reported their find to Dawson, who was quick to realize this was a fragment of a very ancient skull. But keeping his nerve like a true British gentleman should, Dawson asked the workers if they'd found the rest of the skull. "It's over there in those dumps," they said. Weird, isn't it? The workers know that this eccentric chap would pay them handsomely for the skull, and yet they break it into pieces and discard them as rubbish. Dawson later returned several times to the pit to sift through the gravel, but only a few years later did he chance upon another fragment of the skull, and then another too. Only then a decision was made to sift through the entire amount of gravel still remaining in the pit. In the spring of 1912, Dawson finally reported his find to Arthur Smith Woodward, an employee of the British Museum. This whole story looks pretty lame from today's perspective. The workers and Dawson's actions seem pretty weird. And yet, people took it at face value at the time. Dawson, now joined by Woodward, continued his search. Together, they managed to find half of the lower jaw, more pieces of the skull, bones of prehistoric animals, and even some stone tools. In December of 1912, the finds were presented to the members of the Geological Society of London. It was proposed to classify the creature as a new genus and species. This very early anthropoid ape surprisingly had a brain that nearly matched in size that of modern humans, and yet sported an ape-like lower jaw. More finds were soon to follow, a canine tooth and fragments of the nasal bone. In 1915, just 2 miles away from the original dig site, another 2 fragments of the skull and a molar were unearthed, the so-called Piltdown II. Interestingly, there were no more finds after Dawson's death in 1916. Several reconstructions were made of the Piltdown man's appearance. This one, and this one, and this. This is a later version, made in 1950. The scientists believed the skull must have belonged to a woman. And now I'll share with you some facts about the life of this amazing creature. Sir Arthur Woodward, who dedicated many years to studying Eoanthropus, writes the following in his book The Earliest Englishman. Piltdown man may have built shelters of boughs in the forest to live in during the summertime. But there is not much doubt that he would go to rock shelters in the wintertime And in wet weather, Piltdown man would have to contend not only with bears, but also with hyenas, which were then numerous in Western Europe. Piltdown man would probably make a fireplace in the same way as do many existing savages, by lining a hollow in the ground with pieces of stone. Piltdown man, however, was evidently a mixed feeder. He ate roots, nuts and seeds. He was perhaps ungainly and may have walked with a shuffling gait. For dress, Piltdown man would have to depend on skins, which he would wear with the fur turned inside. Sadly, Woodward passed away in 1944, so he didn't live to see the Piltdown hoax finally debunked in 1953. The skull was found to have belonged to a modern human, while his lower jaw in fact belonged to a red ape, or orangutan, with his teeth deliberately sharpened. The whole thing was weathered with paint to look older. This hoax has been explained in graphic detail multiple times. An annotated bibliography on the Piltdown sources spans many dozen pages. A number of books on the Piltdown hoax have been published that try to deduce who was the actual guilty party. I don't think I can give you the definitive answer, but in my humble opinion, Dawson's hand in the hoax is pretty obvious. As for his accomplices, he didn't really need to let anyone in on the plan. Moreover, involving others would have dramatically increased the chances of his secret being leaked. But it's not for me to be a judge of this. I'd rather tell you about some myths surrounding the history of the Piltdown hoax. I did a short talk on this at the Scientists Against Myth Forum back in 2022. My talk is backed by several publications, the links to which can be found in the extra materials list in the description below. Piltdown is often cited as a great example of how science can do away with its own erroneous theories. Indeed, the scholars did get things right in the end. The fraud was successfully debunked, even though its author could no longer be brought to justice. Surely the truth is always revealed. But the question is this a good example? It took 4 decades to debunk this myth. Some authors joked that a chimp would have taken less time to do it. What took them so long? Okay, let's start with Piltdown myth number 1. The debunking of the Piltdown hoax marked a triumph of innovative research methods. Indeed, I also state this in my book. But in actual fact, it's a yes and no case. On the one hand, it's true. The final argument that the Piltdown skull and jaw were faked was based on fluorine dating results. This method is based on a consistent pattern. Fluorine present in soil is gradually absorbed by buried bone material. Thus, the older the bone is, the more fluorine it must contain. This isn't a very reliable metric, as the rates of fluorine absorption may differ. But if the bones are located close to one another, their relative age can be determined. In 1948, this method was used to determine the age of a famous find, the Galley Hill Man. Its age was initially estimated to be between 170 to 300,000 years, but the fluorine method found it to be no older than 10,000 years old. The fluorine method also helped to prove the age of another find from the British Isles, the Swanscombe skull, found a short distance away from Galley Hill. The reliable results shown by this method and the possibility to use it for dating small bone fragments have urged archaeologists to use it to date the Piltdown finds. October 1948, Edwards, the curator of the Department of Geology at the British Museum, gave a permission to take the bones of Eoanthropus as well as the bones of other mammals found at Piltdown for a fluorine test. The initial test results showed that the Eoanthropus bones were all the same age, including the fragments of the Piltdown II skull, found 2 miles away from the first site. However, much to everyone's surprise, the bones turned out to be unexpectedly young, much younger in fact than the animal bones found next to them. The researchers were also surprised to see fresh dental tissue under the older darker tissue, which they discovered when drilling one of the teeth for a test sample. It all seemed pretty suspicious. 3 years later, when the Fluorine method had been improved to a level where it could yield results for very tiny samples weighing just a few milligrams, it was tested again on the Piltdown material. It showed that, quote, whereas the Piltdown cranium may well be Upper Pleistocene, the mandible, canine tooth and isolated molar are quite modern, end of quote. So, it was a mixed collection of individuals of different ages, a Lego set if you wish. Okay, so has a new dating technique had the final say? In actual fact, fluorine testing was first used in the 19th century when it helped debunk another popular archaeological myth known as the Calaveras skull. It was reportedly found by miners in a mining shaft under a layer of lava at the depth of 40 meters. It was claimed to be millions of years old, but the fluorine test conducted in 1879 demonstrated that the skull was not ancient at all. It probably originated from a Native American burial and was thrown into the shaft as a sort of practical joke. The Calaveras skull is now believed to be less than 1,000 years old. In 1899, American author and poet Bret Harte even wrote a humorous poem to the Pliocene skull. The poet addresses the ancient find. Speak, O man less recent, fragmentary fossil, older than the trees, older than the hills. Tell us thy strange story, when beside thee walked the solemn plesiosaurus. Tell the wondrous secret of your past existence. Speak, the oldest primate. And the skull says, my name is Bowers, and my crust was busted, falling down a shaft in Calaveras County, but I'd take it kindly if it sent the pieces home to old Missouri. The creationists have a knack for citing the Piltdown man on any possible occasion as this evolutionist fake. And yet the creationists have often cited another fake, the Calaveras skull, as an example of an out-of-place artifact ignored by paleontologists. The debunking of the Calaveras hoax was the first time the Fluorine method was used to date ancient bone material. And it had been done long before the Piltdown testing. The technique was far from perfect at the time, but nonetheless functional. Radiocarbon or C14 dating was another method that helped debunk the Eoanthropus myth. It confirmed that the skull and the jaw were not the same age and that they were only a few hundred years old at most. I should point out that the Piltdown skull and jaw were dated at least twice, and both times the results were slightly different. The C14 test was first performed on Piltdown only in 1959. By that time, it had been refined to a point where you no longer had to burn the entire sample. Fragments of the Piltdown jaw and the right parietal bone were handed over to Professor Fries for dating. The jaw was found to be 500 years old or so, and the skull 620 years old. This put an end to the Piltdown man, but also raised new questions. It was already clear that the jaw belonged to a red ape, but how on earth did a 500-year-old orangutan end up on the green hills of England? According to one theory, this skull came from an ethnographic collection. It could have been bought from the Dayaks, a tribe that used to keep orangutan skulls as relics for many generations. Another test was conducted in 1989. This time the Piltdown 2 skull and the jaw were dated. A much more advanced method, the accelerator mass spectrometry, was now utilized. The results were different from the 1959 test. The skull was found to be 970 years old, while the jaw was no older than 100 to 200 years old. A jaw of that age could easily have come from a museum collection. But why such a huge difference from the earlier tests? Finally, a third test was conducted in 2016. Samples from 3 Piltdown fragments were used: the frontal bone, the parietal bone, and the jaw. But the test failed due to a very poor condition of the samples, there's serious pollution, and an absence of datable material in them. The researchers conclude that, quote, the previous conventional and accelerated determinations of the Piltdown orang and human material must be viewed with great caution, end of quote. So, the Fluorine method wasn't new at the time, even though it hadn't been used for about 50 years. The C14 dating results were inconclusive. The teeth examination with a microscope helped prove that Piltdown was in fact a hoax. Traces of working the teeth with abrasives were detected. There were powerful microscopes 100 years ago already, so there was every possibility to examine the teeth, but surprisingly, no one cared enough to do it. However, they did do an X-ray scan of the lower jaw, a cutting-edge technology at the time, even though it was conducted in an offhand way. The dentist who examined the X-rays pointed out at some puzzling inconsistencies. Strong tooth wear indicated an old age, and near the large cavity of the canine pulp was a typical feature of a young individual. Clearly a mismatch. But no one paid attention to this observation. And even before Eoanthropus was presented to the public, a piece of his skull was tested for traces of organics by Woodhead. If the jaw had been examined too, they would probably have noted different composition of organics in the skull and jaw. But for some reason, they overlooked that too. The Fluorine method had been significantly improved by the mid-20th century. A nitrogen test was also conducted after the Fluorine test, which too pointed out at the different ages of the skull and the jaw. Other tests were conducted on the specimens, including a DNA test in the 21st century. Scientists even managed to trace the orang that had donated its skull to the Piltdown man to a specific region in the island of Borneo. But it's pretty obvious now that a lack of a high-precision examination method in the early 20th century would hardly have prevented the scientists from identifying a fake. It was the researchers' offhand approach to the examination of the remains that made the hoax possible. If they had carefully used the methods available to them, they would have quickly figured out it was a fraud. So, what hindered them? We can assume that the experts who had access to the Piltdown material were, shall we say, a bit too enthusiastic about the find, because it fitted their concept of the human evolution very nicely. Scientists at the time tried to figure out which part of our body was the first to develop, the human-sized brain or the dental apparatus. The first version obviously seemed more flattering. Surely a well-developed brain pointed at a profound mental capacity, not some teeth. Quote, "The growth of the brain preceded the refinement of the features and of the somatic characters in general." End of quote. This is what Dawson and Woodward wrote in 1913. Eoanthropus was, you could say, a physical illustration to this theory. Today we know that it was the dental apparatus that came ahead of the brain during the evolution, as well as the legs, the hands and the pelvis, with the cranium bringing up the rear. The Piltdown man offered a more noble version of the human evolution, a flattering but an erroneous one. Some British scholars rejoiced that those early human remains had been finally found not somewhere far away like Java, not in Germany, France or Spain, but right there in jolly old England, something they'd been waiting for so long. Woodward proudly titled his book The Earliest Englishman. A lot of the Piltdown authors had no possibility to personally conduct tests on the remains. All they could do was reiterate the conclusions of their peers who had already conducted the tests, trusting their authority without questioning. It's just like that today, too. Most people will just paraphrase someone else's research, with no possibility to verify its accuracy. But some people weren't that easy to fool. So here comes myth number 2. The discovery of Eoanthropus was accepted by the scientific community without questioning. In actual fact, there has never been any scientific consensus regarding the Piltdown man. Critical voices could be heard during the presentation of the finds at the Geological Society in 1912. Of the 10 scientists who spoke at the meeting, 2 were skeptical. Sir Ray Lancaster expressed his doubt as to both the skull and the jaw belonging to the same individual. Professor Waterstone seconded him. Quote, "It was very difficult to believe that the 2 specimens could have come from the same individual." End of quote. A number of notable authors would back that opinion many times later, most of them outside the UK. Among them were French anthropologist Marcelin Boule, Czech anthropologist Aleš Lička, German anthropologist Franz Weidenreich, American zoologist and botanist Gerrit Smith Miller, the latter also quoted by Soviet anthropologists. The Piltdown man became the focus of a heated debate, with little chance of coming to a consensus. Miller was especially skeptical, pointing out that the skull and the jaw didn't match each other at all, the skull being very massive and the jaw thin and gracile. In real primates, it's vice versa. The jaw is more massive than the skull. Muscle attachments didn't match either. A skull with such protruding jaws is a poorly balanced structure. In short, the jaw didn't belong to the skull but came from an ape. Miller even went as far as proposing a new chimpanzee species, the British Pleistocene chimpanzee or Panvitus, the ancient chimpanzee. In his later publications, he would doggedly refer to the Piltdown jaw only as Panvitus. This must have been his subtle way of trolling his opponents. When criticized for that, he would quip that if one found a fossilized horse skull and nearby a horn, one would have every right to assume that both ones belonged to a living unicorn. However, one should dismiss this interpretation as being highly unlikely. Combination of a human skull and an ape jaw didn't make much sense to many scholars. The doubtful were ultimately proven right. But this wasn't the first time such heated debates took place around an anthropological find. A similar controversy followed the discovery of Pithecanthropus in the late 1800s. Critics pointed out that an ape jaw and a human femur can't go together in the same body. Some of the world's leading scholars were vocal about this. Anthropologist Rudolf Virchow believed that the skull attributed to Pithecanthropus in fact belonged to a giant gibbon ape, while the femur was undoubtedly human. And he wasn't alone in his skepticism. Ales Glichka wrote in 1930, "We are relieved after so much vague and inconclusive data surrounding Pithecanthropus and Eoanthropus to turn our attention to a simple, natural and easily defined find, to the lower jaw of Homo heidelbergensis." Gerrit Miller pointed a number of high-profile finds in his article on the origins of humanity, which came out in 1920. He dismissed Eoanthropus and Pithecanthropus as questionable finds, describing them as not certainly parts of one animal. In his paper, Miller also discusses the so-called similar hypothesis, which sees origins of modern humans in an ape, and the Tarsian hypothesis, which postulates that humans have originated from a Tarsier-like ancestor. Miller doubted both these theories. By that time, scholars had collected sufficient evidence to be able to accept the origin of humans from ancient primates as fact. But the crucial data was still missing that would have enabled scientists to settle on either concept. In which part of the world did first humans come to be? Was it Europe, Africa, or Asia? What were their ancestors? How did the transformation happen? From brain down to legs, or the other way around? Eoanthropus and Pithecanthropus were the embodiments of these rivaling theories. A human skull with an ape jaw, or an ape jaw with a human femur? Which set was more fanciful? A lot of experts doubted both. Scientific skepticism is a great thing. If you have extraordinary hypotheses, you've got to show extraordinary evidence. A lot of things we once dismissed as fantastical may one day become part of our reality. What good would it have done if we dismissed Piltdown and Pithecanthropus to follow? It would hardly be reasonable to discard a weird find just because it's weird. And so, Piltdown remained on the books as a sort of enigmatic deviation. On top of that, the evidence of an ape jaw not matching the skull posed another conundrum. How did an ape end up in Ice Age Britain? Any evidence of that was yet to be found. No such finds have been made yet. In actual fact, anthropoid finds are few and far between, so an ape jaw found next to a human skull was regarded as something implausible. Woodward wrote ironically of his opponents, quote, They have supposed that at Piltdown we have discovered an entirely new kind of human skull lacking its lower jaw, and an equally new kind of ape jaw lacking the skull. This would be a startling result indeed to achieve in a single cubic yard of gravel." End of quote. The skull and the jaw sitting next to each other, their similar sizes and state of preservation, a high implausibility of a Pleistocene ape having once roamed Britain, all that was strong evidence that it was a single individual. Unless, of course, we consider an option of a deliberate fraud. Piltdown too offered strong evidence with new skull fragments and an unusually shaped molar. One could argue that there could be some shade of probability of a jaw and skull ending up in the same context. But twice. On the other hand, the scholars did the right thing by not dismissing the finds whose provenance still had to be clarified. Despite that, the available finds were not researched thoroughly enough. And it wasn't because nobody was allowed to touch those items, well hidden at the British Museum. There was no need to do that. The First World War broke out. There was no internet. It was a long and costly endeavor for overseas scientists to travel all the way to Britain to personally examine the bones. So it was common practice at the time to study casts, and it's hard to detect a fraud from its cast. Skeptics would often point out that a cast did not show the smallest features on a bone. If only you'd seen the original bone, then surely you'd have made the right judgment. Scholars all over the world had no choice but to accept Piltdown as a weird and controversial find, which gradually became even weirder and even more controversial, and was even harder to fit in with later finds. American anthropologist George Grant McCurdy wrote in 1916 that prehistoric archaeologists sometimes discover some rather unusual kin, but none of these finds is nearly as remarkable as the Piltdown collection. Nature set many traps for the scientists, but here at Piltdown she has surpassed herself. British anthropologist Sir Arthur Keith, one of the leading Piltdown researchers, was of a similar opinion. Some 500,000 years ago, Sussex was home to a strange form of mankind. As far as I know, nobody had expected such an exotic mix of human and ape features, he wrote. In this context, I can't but mention a popular creationist claim. And this is our myth number 3. The Piltdown hoax was created in order to prove human evolution was real. Some journalists at the time claimed that at last the missing link had been found. Fast forward 100 years or so, and that's how media still like to label every new hominid species found. Odopithecus, Sahelanthropus, Erarin, Homo antecessor, Australopithecus sediba, all of them missing links. But in actual fact, by the time Eoanthropus was discovered, the human evolutionary theory had already been widely accepted by the scientific community as fact. A number of European Neanderthal finds had already been published, including nearly complete skeletons. Finds had been made in the Spy Cave in Belgium, in La Mustier, La Chapelle-aux-Saints, La Ferracie, and La Quinard caves in France. The Java Pithecanthropus had already graced headlines all over the world. The Heidelberg Ger was unearthed in Germany in 1907. The person behind the Piltdown Man hoax must have been aware of those finds. It might actually have been the uproar around the Heidelberg Man discovery reaching Britain which motivated Charles Dawson to attempt the Piltdown hoax. In his letters, Dawson expressed hope that his discovery could rival the Heidelberg Man. We may never learn of his motives, but proving the reality of human evolution was hardly his main drive at all. More likely, his ambition was to demonstrate that England could also lay claim to being the ancestral home of humanity, as well as try and confirm the rapid brain development hypothesis. Some also believe that Dawson's only ambition was capitalizing on the discovery. He used whatever materials he had on hand, doing the best he could. As more finds of real fossilized hominids were reported, Eoanthropus was increasingly perceived as being out of place, and more scholars were beginning to view it as an insoluble puzzle. Homo rhodesiensis was published in 1921. The pecking man, or Homo erectus pekinensis, made headlines worldwide that year too, and new finds made in Java, Sangaran, Mojokerto, and Guangdong confirmed the authenticity of Pithecanthropus. Progressive Paleoanthropus was found at Mount Carmel in Palestine. Important finds were reported in Europe as well. Steinheim and Swanscombe finds were published around that time, and all those finds were poles apart from the Anthropus. The Piltdown man was partially responsible for slower acceptance of new finds by the scientific community. Australopithecus africanus, discovered in South Africa by Raymond Dodd, was one of them. Many eminent experts commented on this discovery at the time. Arthur Smith Woodward was vocally critical of the find. Writing about the quest for the human ancestor, he was adamant that, quote, "The new fossil from South Africa has little bearing on the question." End of quote. Indeed, what could this obscure ape with its barbaric Latin-Greek name possibly have in common with the noble Piltdown ancestor? This Professor Dodd and his absurd find cannot be taken seriously. But even Woodward would later go on to accept Australopithecus. In his last book, which came out after Woodward's death in 1948, he attempts to fit the Piltdown man in the existing evolutionary theory, expressing his radically polycentric views. He wrote, quote, "When a new group of animals appeared, it was not descended from a single pair of the ancestors which preceded it, but from several ancestors approaching it in the same or different ways." End of quote. And then, quote, "The Piltdown man in Europe and Pithecanthropus in Asia seem to have evolved independently from two different sets of ancestral apes. The refinement of the face in the one beginning with the forehead, that of the other beginning with the jaws." End of quote. So, Pithecanthropus and Sinanthropus descended from Australopithecus in Asia, in whom their refinement of the face began with the jaws. In other words, human evolution followed the scheme accepted by the majority of anthropologists today, while in Europe the original species of Eoanthropus emerged. A lack of reliable dating methods made it difficult for scholars of the time to settle down on a particular evolutionary scheme. It was further complicated by the known remains of what was anatomically modern humans. Some of those were believed to be very ancient, dating back to Pleistocene or even Pliocene, that is, being contemporaries of Australopithecus. The foxhole jaw, the Castanedal skeletons, the Gully Hill skull, the Telgai skull, the Aldovai man, and others. When all these finds were properly dated after World War II, the Pliocene sapiens disappeared from all scientific books, remaining only in creationist writings, where it still thrives to this day. But there was a time when it was a force to be reckoned with. But even before its debunking, Piltdown was no longer regarded as a key player in human evolution. Arthur Keith, an anthropologist involved in Piltdown research, is quite remarkable in that respect. Keith was an opponent of Woodward's. When reconstructing the skull of Eoanthropus, Woodward was inclined to give it primitive features, with a brain volume of only about 1,000 cubic centimeters. But Keith pointed out that the skull had in fact a modern structure with a volume of 1,400 cubic centimeters. Keith managed to confirm the correctness of his reconstruction with an experiment. He asked his students to break an arbitrary skull of a modern human into pieces, which roughly corresponded to the Piltdown fragments. Keith made a reconstruction based on those bones. His result was very similar to the original skull. So, Keith made an accurate reconstruction of the Piltdown skull, with an exception of adding an ape jaw to the skull. But here's what I believe to be Keith's real breakthrough. It has to do with the so-called stadial theory, one of the most popular human evolution theories at the time. According to this theory, human evolution was a sequence of discrete stages, each represented by only a single hominid species. You must have learned about it at school. First there came Pithecanthropus, who was followed by Homo heidelbergensis, succeeded by Homo neanderthalensis, and ultimately Cro-Magnon. When Keith compared Neanderthals and modern humans known at the time, He came to a conclusion that Neanderthals could not have been the ancestors of modern humans. Why? Well, very simply because there was a time when Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons co-inhabited Europe. We know today that Keith studied what was then believed to be very early modern humans, who are now dated to much later times. An example of this is the Galley Hill skull, now dated to 3,500 years ago. Another one is the Combe-Capelle skull, only 10,000 years old. It's also Aldovey 1, only 17,000 years old. The evolutionary scheme created by Keith shows Combe-Capelle and Galley Hill as Europeans, while Aldovey as the ancestor of modern Africans, which of course looks totally unlikely from today's perspective. But surprisingly, despite being based on false data, Keith made the right conclusion that there existed several independent evolutionary lines in Pleistocene, all of which became humans. These lines were believed to be Neanderthals, the ancestors of modern humans, and Neoanthropus, whom Keith believed to be an extinct representative of an evolutionary dead end, along with Neanderthals. Keith wrote that science was used to the concept of a single modern human species. But this could have been different in the ancient times. Current anthropoid apes are divided into species and subspecies. Why should humans be an exception? Further, we realize that the 3 or 4 human types so far discovered represent but a few fossil twigs of the great evolutionary human tree. We may hope to find many more branches." End of quote. This is so in sync with the modern views. In 1953, when the Piltdown fake was finally exposed, it became another argument in favor of the good old stadial theory. The Euanthropus branch was no longer there, and scholars were happy to resurrect the arrow-shaped model of human evolution. Australopithecus, Pithecanthropus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, and finally Homo sapiens. It was a simple and elegant scheme. As for the stadial theory, just like the Piltdown man, it is now part of the history of science. We now know that the Neanderthals are indeed not our direct ancestors. As for our evolutionary tree, it has sprouted many more branches, which Keith could not have imagined even in his wildest dreams. Euanthropus is no longer there, having been replaced by the Denisovans, the Hobbits, the late surviving Homo erectus of Java, Homo naledi of South Africa, and others. So, what led to the Piltdown man being finally debunked? Perhaps it had nothing to do with the advancement of dating techniques, but was due to a simple fact that the development of scientific knowledge made this fossil completely unnecessary. Other evolutionary lines were regularly supported by new facts and finds, while Euanthropus just sort of hung in the air. The Piltdown man was gradually losing his supporters, until it became absolutely safe to publicly debunk him. Hardly any scholars took him seriously anymore. Euanthropus had been refuted well before his debunking. When he was debunked, some scholars must have breathed a sigh of relief. The suspended and mysterious find had finally been placed on some firm foundation, even if that foundation was not a scientific one. In June 1954, Sir Gavin de Beer, director of the British Museum of Natural History, concluded with the following words, quote, "We have laid the ghost of Piltdown man, who, as it happens, never fitted very happily into any scheme of man's evolution." End of quote. So does this mean that there is no more place in modern anthropology for strange mysteries and exotic finds? Sure thing there is. Look at Hobbit floresiensis. It was a similar kind of unexpected and unconnected find, which was in stark contradiction to the preconceived notions of the human evolution going necessarily hand in hand with increasing brain size. This discovery sparked a heated debate back in the early 2000s, as had Pithecanthropus, Australopithecus, and the Piltdown man. To this day, some scholars are skeptical about the tiny hominids called Homo floresiensis, believing it to be a Homo sapiens with a rare pathology, such as microcephalism, the Down syndrome, or a similar ailment. By the way, there is another similarity between the Hobbit and the Piltdown cases. Homo floresiensis occupies a very special position among our ancestry. Should this discovery ever be debunked too, it will hardly cause a ripple in the overall theory of human evolution. But I'm pretty confident that it wouldn't be that easy to cancel Homo floresiensis today. As we can see now, the skepticism of part of the scientific community is by no means a death sentence for a theory. Let us never forget Eoanthropus. Hopefully his case will help scholars keep a cool head in the face of possible sensational finds to be made in the future. This is the legacy of the Piltdown man. 40 years of the history of the Piltdown man, his appearance had been reconstructed multiple times. After the hoax was debunked, these useless experiments were no longer attempted. But why don't we try it one more time? Let's imagine that Eoanthropus once did walk the earth. What appearance would we get with modern forensic reconstruction techniques? We asked our friends from the Ancestral Whispers project to try and create a portrait of the Piltdown man. You may remember their reconstruction of the crystal skull face. It turned out they'd already experimented with the Piltdown skull a year before, so they'd enthusiastically agreed. The team was inspired by the Morris Wilson reconstruction of 1950. The 1915 skull reconstruction by McGregor provided the basis for the portrait. We thought the earliest Briton from the early 20th century had to be fair-skinned, blue-eyed and have reddish hair. And here's what we got. We showed this reconstruction to anthropologist Stanislav Drobyshevskiy, science editor of anthropogynist.ru. Well, I can think of several options as it normally happens. Based on his white face, wide forehead, a medium-sized supercilium and a massive nose, this could be either a Neanderthal or a Denisovan. His hair is too reddish for a Pithecanthropus and his forehead a bit too high, and he doesn't really look like one. So my guess it's either a Neanderthal or a Denisovan. But since we don't have any complete Denisovan skulls, I draw this out. Theoretically, this could be a reconstruction of a Chinese Homo, such as the recently found Homo longi from Harbin in China. Quite possible, especially given his puffed up lips and his not very big eye sockets. So my verdict is, it's got to be some kind of archaic human. He's got grey irises, while we know that Denisovans were black-eyed. So I'm inclined to think it's a Neanderthal. He's got prominent cheekbones, by the way. I like this reconstruction. His beard is pretty nice looking, though we know that archaic humans, including Neanderthals, sported very dark skin, hair and eyes, with only a few Neanderthals being different. So this guy could be one of those. And yeah, it's a very lifelike reconstruction. He looks alive. The reconstruction itself is accurate and looks nice. But the skull is wrong. He looks like a Neanderthal. But since the skull is a fake, there isn't much point in this reconstruction. Never mind what I said about him being an archaic human. His jaw comes from a red ape, and his skull is that of a modern human. In fact, his white skull with a relatively high forehead and a not too high supercilium does make it look like a typical Neanderthal. Were he a Pithecanthropus, he would have a narrower skull. And mind you that he doesn't have a face. The only part of the face he has is the lower jaw, hence this protrusion, which makes him similar to Denisovans, if we accept those recently found skulls from China as Denisovans. And my guess about the eye sockets was that, just a guess, since he hasn't really got a face. this face-forward projection doesn't really betray his jaw as that of an orang, so it looks like an archaic jaw without a chin, typical of any archaic human. I'm not sure what the reconstructor's reasoning was behind this wide jaw, but this sloping lower jaw where the condyle width is pronounced, while the angular width is not, is a typical Neanderthal feature. This is a high-quality reconstruction, but I guess the reconstructor's talents could have been better applied in some real science. It's like you can build a nuclear power plant to give light and heat to people, or you can build a nuke. Well, this portrait is like a nuke, really. It'll spread around the interwebs in no time, and freaks of every kind will use this picture to claim that scientists take the Piltdown man seriously, or else why would they have reconstructed his face again? And if that's so, then aliens do visit Earth, and the Great Pyramid was built with concrete. I'm looking at this picture and I can see it's just an artist's fantasy. And it's my guess that they chose to base it on Neanderthal features for a reason. Cro-Magnon or Pithecanthropus features wouldn't be nearly as convincing. They took an abstract archaic human and they ended up with just that kind of face. And that's how he was born. My issue with this reconstruction is that the face is depicted to look like a real one, and the reconstruction doesn't really match the skull. In a real face, the layer of muscles would be thinner. Here it's hard to see because of his massive beard. His lower jaw doesn't match the skull for a simple reason that it's not human. I think his pronounced cheekbones and cheeks don't really match this elegant lower jaw. An orang jaw is a big thing, but it's not really noticeable in the portrait. And there seems to be a bit too much soft tissue. And his nose is a total mess too. Why are the nostrils pointing down? The area between the alveolar bone of the upper jaw and the piriform aperture of the nose is way too wide to be realistic. Even the broken heel skull sports a less prominent one. If they based the nose on their own render of the skull, it would be placed much higher and look very unusual. His labial mucosa is too narrow, the lips should protrude, much more visibly in case of prognathism. But then his upper lip would look unrealistic and the nose would be too small. So the reconstruction doesn't match the actual skull, because the reconstructors were probably inspired by depictions of Neanderthal faces. And the skull itself is not that of a Neanderthal. They could have made it any color they fancied. Could be bald or with hair spikes like a porcupine. What does it matter really? Could have even drawn fish scales instead of his skin. It's a fantasy after all. The Ancestral Whispers team has also used a neural network to create a series of funny portraits of the Piltdown man. Enjoy!